In 141 BC, a professional scout walked into a famine village in northern China, opened a 14-year-old boy's mouth, counted his teeth, bent his fingers one by one, and then turned to the boy's father and said a number. The father did not negotiate. He held out his hand. Coins dropped into his palm. And the boy's mother, who had said goodbye the night before because she already knew this morning was coming, did not come outside at all. That boy's name was Wei, and what happened to him inside the walls of Imperial China was so deliberately designed, so systematically engineered, and so completely erased from official memory that most people alive today have never heard a single word about it. This was not a war crime. This was not a plague. This was a business. It had job titles and price lists and profit margins and a 40% acceptable death rate built directly into its operating costs. It ran continuously for over 2,000 years, recorded by historians with the same casual tone they used for crop reports. And the civilization that built it was not some brutal empire at the edges of the ancient world. It was China, the most literate, most philosophically sophisticated culture on Earth. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how that system worked, what it did to the boys trapped inside it, and why the most powerful man in China could wake up in a palace one morning and be dead before sunset. And you will understand why Wei, the boy with the wooden comb his mother pressed into his hands at the last moment, never got to keep even his own name. The scouts had a title, Renjia. It translates directly as human teeth, not as an insult, as a professional designation. These were the men whose job was to travel through the poorest provinces during famine seasons with contracts and price lists, searching for boys who met a very specific set of criteria. Clear skin, bright eyes, delicate bone structure, long fingers, because long fingers suggested potential for the guqin, the 7-stringed instrument considered essential in any educated household. But appearance alone was not enough. They wanted intelligence, someone who could memorize classical poetry, hold a conversation with a provincial governor, and learn fast enough to justify the investment. Because the buyers were not looking for servants, they were looking for companions, and companions needed to be impressive. Wei had all of it. The scout had been watching him for 2 weeks before approaching his father. The contract was written in classical Chinese his father could not read. It committed Wei to 15 years of service. His father pressed his seal into the document, and that was the end of the negotiation. Wei was taken the same afternoon. He looked back once. His mother was not there. He would spend the rest of his life trying to remember the exact sound of her voice saying his name, because after that afternoon nobody would ever say it again. The first thing they took was the name. Wei arrived at the training house carrying 3 things: a pair of sandals, a wooden comb his mother had pressed into his hands at the gate, and a name that connected him to every person who had ever loved him. Within hours all 3 were gone. He was given a new name, Autumn Jade, not a term of affection, a product label designed to sound expensive and appeal to wealthy buyers. His head was shaved. He was dressed in silk robes that marked him as property. And from that morning forward, every hour of his existence was scheduled, monitored, and controlled. The training program lasted between 2 and 4 years, and from the outside it resembled an elite education. Classical poetry memorized by the thousands of verses, calligraphy practiced until the brushstrokes matched a master's, music, dance, medicine, political philosophy, anything that increased the final price at auction. But underneath that education, something far more deliberate was happening. Any expression of homesickness was corrected through punishment. Any sign of independent thought was treated as a defect in the product. Any memory of family, of the village, of the name his mother gave him, was systematically broken down until the boy genuinely believed his only purpose in the world was to please whoever purchased him. That was the real curriculum. Not obedience, belief. They did not need boys who had learned to comply. They needed boys who had forgotten there was any other way to exist. And here is the part that history buried the deepest. Tang Dynasty records suggest that roughly 4 out of every 10 boys purchased for training did not survive to become concubines at all. 4 out of 10. Consumed by exhaustion and malnutrition, and the psychological weight of having their identity dismantled before they were old enough to understand what identity even meant. They were buried without markers in training house courtyards. Their families were never contacted. They vanished as if they had never been born. And the system absorbed that loss and kept running, because this was not cruelty operating outside the rules. This was a business model that calculated a 40% mortality rate into its overhead and found it acceptable. The scouts knew. The trainers knew, the buyers knew, The Confucian scholars who wrote volumes about virtue and moral governance knew, because most of them owned favourites themselves. Buddhist monks who preached detachment from worldly desire hid favourites in monastery quarters. This system did not exist alongside Chinese morality. It existed because of Chinese power, and somewhere in a courtyard in the capital, a boy named Autumn Jade, who used to be named Wei, was learning to forget that distinction. If this story is hitting different from anything you have heard before, subscribe to Vile History right now, because what comes next is where it gets truly unimaginable. For the boys who survived, the reward was a different kind of prison, and this is the part most histories miss entirely, because it looks on the surface like comfort. Rooms with silk curtains and jade ornaments and fine lacquered furniture. Beautiful, comfortable, locked from the outside, because the silk was not a reward, it was a cage designed to look like one. A boy surrounded by luxury convinces himself the transaction was worth it. A boy with a title and fine clothing begins to defend the system that imprisoned him, because the alternative is admitting everything he endured meant nothing. Comfort was a control mechanism more powerful than chains, because chains make a prisoner angry, but silk makes a prisoner grateful, and a grateful prisoner pleases himself. Daily life was an unending performance beginning before dawn, because appearing unprepared meant falling from favour, and falling from favour meant being discarded with nothing. No family willing to claim you, no skills that worked outside a palace, no name that was even yours. At 20, your useful life was considered finished. At 25, you were invisible. Competition inside a single household was deliberately vicious, masters rewarding whoever entertained best and starving whoever pleased least. Weakness gets you replaced. That was the only law, and every boy learned it or disappeared. Inside the Imperial Palace, the system operated on a scale that makes everything described so far look restrained. Historian Brett Hinch documented that all 10 emperors during the first 2 centuries of the Han dynasty had official male favourites, all 10, written into government histories as administrative fact. But one story from those records permanently changed the Chinese language. His name was Dong Xian, 17 years old. The Book of Han describes him as having a face like white jade and eyes that caught light in a crowded room. Emperor Ai noticed him during a routine ceremony in 4 BC, and the obsession that followed consumed the entire government. Estates, titles, treasure worth millions transferred to a teenager. When Prime Minister Wang Jia wrote a careful letter warning that this devotion was becoming dangerous, Emperor Ai had him arrested on fabricated charges. Wang Jia did not survive the imprisonment. While all of this was happening somewhere in a palace household in the same city, a boy who had once been named Wei was turning 20 years old and already becoming invisible. But before Dong Xian's story ends, you need to hear the warning that came before it. Dingtong started as a boatman, a nobody, until Emperor Wen had a dream about a man in a yellow hat helping him reach heaven, woke up, found Dingtong wearing a yellow cap on the river, and made him the most powerful commoner in China overnight. He was given a copper mine and the right to mint his own currency. His coins circulated across the entire empire. He became wealthier than princes. He was so devoted that when Emperor Wen developed a painful wound, Dingtong cleaned it personally with his own mouth, a service not even the crown prince would provide. A fortune teller once examined his face and said he would die of starvation. Emperor Wen laughed. "I am the one who made him rich," he said. "How could he possibly starve?" But Emperor Wen died, and the crown prince, who had been humiliated at his own father's bedside by a commoner's devotion, confiscated everything overnight. The richest man in China died alone on the streets, penniless, starving exactly as predicted. The favourite's power lasted exactly as long as his emperor's heartbeat. That was the warning. Nobody listened. By 1 BC, Dong Xian was supreme commander of the armed forces at 22 years old, with no military experience whatsoever. And then came the moment that rewrote the language. A quiet afternoon in the imperial chambers, Dong Xian falls asleep with his head resting on the emperor's sleeve. Emperor Ai needs to rise for court business, looks down at Dong Xian sleeping peacefully, and instead of waking him reaches for a blade and silently cuts off his own imperial robe rather than disturb that rest. The story spread through court by nightfall. Officials began cutting their own sleeves in imitation. The phrase "passion of the cut sleeve" entered Chinese as the definitive expression for this kind of devotion, and remained in use for 2,000 years. Subscribe to Vile History right now, because this is exactly where the story breaks, and it breaks in a way nobody sees coming. Emperor Ai collapsed in August of 1 BC at 26 years old. The Grand Empress Dowager moved within hours. She seized the imperial seal and stripped Dongxian of every title, every rank, every possession accumulated across 5 years of absolute favour. On the same day, he lost everything. Dongxian and his wife were both found dead before sunset. The most powerful man in China had woken that morning in a palace that existed because of him. By sunset, he was gone. Deng Tong's warning had come true again, wearing a different face. Rise, fall, erasure. Every dynasty, every generation, the same machine running on different names. The system finally ended, not because China decided it had gone too far, but because the imperial structure that sustained it collapsed entirely. The revolution of 1911 dismantled the dynasties. The communist victory of 1949 brought interrogations, labour camps, and punishment for whoever remained. The revolution that promised liberation found new uses for the same people the old system had already destroyed. And the last generation simply vanished, abandoned, carrying names that were never theirs into a country that had no place for what they were. We know the emperors by name. We know Dongxian and Deng Tong and Hanyan. We know the cut-sleeve story well enough that it still lives in the language today. But Wei, the 14-year-old boy with the wooden comb his mother pressed into his hands at the gate on the last morning she ever saw him, and the thousands like him buried without markers in training house courtyards, and the ones discarded at 20 when their faces changed, and the ones who spent their final years on streets they were brought to against their will, carrying names that were never theirs. We do not know a single one of them. Not one name. 2,000 years. Millions of boys. And the system was so precisely, so patiently engineered that it erased not just their lives, but the memory that they ever existed at all. That is not cruelty. That is architecture. And the fact that you had never heard this story before today is the final proof that it worked exactly as designed. Subscribe to Vile History. We dig up the histories that empires spent centuries trying to bury. And if Wei's story stayed with you, share this video. Because the only thing anyone can still do for the nameless ones is refuse to let them be forgotten twice.